Great. Well, thanks so much, Aaron, and all for having me. It's exciting to get to share uh, some of this work and some of my thoughts on this. As I mentioned in my email, I could speak for a few days about all this, so happy to continue these conversations into the future. But yeah, today I'll be talking about primarily about a paper that was led and conceived by Kevin Schwarzwald. He's now a postdoc at the Columbia Climate School, continuing this work, as well as some recent work published with colleagues at NASA GISS, including Gavin Schmidt. And so to start in grounding in IPCC AR6 figure 0, this is a lot of the thinking that I and we all do. And I wanted to start by just thinking about uncertainty with a pretty exciting example going on in the historical period. And so here by historical period, I mean since the advent of surface observation sometime mid 19th century. And since joining NCAR in the past few months, I've really started to appreciate more intimately how critical these historical observations are in climate model development. Especially at NCAR, we're starting to tune and figure out CESM3 and just seeing the role of all these observations in climate model development. And this is so important because all of our science is really based on taking these climate models that hopefully capture all the physical, chemical, biological processes and simulate the past, present, and future climate. And so when we're sitting down and doing science, and especially trying to understand how and where our science can be used, we're really looking at these model simulations as well as the observational data we have to inform our understanding of the Earth's climate. And so to just talk through how I'm starting to think about uncertainty coming in this talk, I wanted to talk about the two really key types of uncertainty in observational data using the surface temperature record as an example. And so a lot of what the work in this particular field is, and the work that I've done is to quantify all known sources of aleatoric uncertainty, which here Ted Shepard has brought over this language of uncertainty into climate science some, but aleatoric uncertainty is really the stochastic, chaotic, random uncertainty. And in this case, what we're talking about is surface temperature and the quantifiable uncertainty we have in surface temperature. And so just as a quick plug, there's a new NASA GISS temp uncertainty ensemble where we have provided two equally likely reconstructions of surface temperature. Great for climate folks that are used to working with ensembles. You work with it in exactly the same way, except instead of spanning internal variability, we're spanning observational uncertainty with this ensemble. But why this is really nice, especially for all you X-array users out there or people that are comfortable writing those big for loops, is it's really easy to include uncertainty in analyses. And so here's just a really simple example of looking at the global monthly mean temperature, or sorry, I think this is global annual mean temperature, as well as the Arctic annual mean temperature, just in these 200 members. And you can see that there's, as expected, much more uncertainty up in the Arctic. And then something we're also constantly battling in this field is our inability to perfectly model, whether with physics or with statistics and machine learning, our inability to completely model our system of interest. And in thinking about our models, we have to attempt to understand the epistemic uncertainty, or really the uncertainty arising from human choices and imperfection of models. And so how this is often done is by comparing different products. And so here's an example of uncertainty estimates from, I think it's 6 or 7 different surface temperature products. And so not only in general do our mean estimates agree of surface temperature, but as I show here, our uncertainty estimates also roughly agree. And so generally this makes us as scientists pretty content, or at least as content as we ever are, and that we like, okay, we're trying a bunch of different methods, we're using slightly different source data, and we're all getting the same estimates of not only temperature, but our uncertainty. So like, okay, we're pretty confident we know what we're talking about. And then people like Duo Chan come along and blow everything out of the water. And so there's been a just pretty ridiculous line of work over the past 5+ years by Duo Chan showing that we're really missing some key uncertainty and bias in our surface temperature record. And so to take up a whole slide with this awesome figure that he just prepared for the NCAR climate data guide page of his new temperature product Descent, which I think is just the best name I've heard in a while for a product. But he really pointed out some issues in particularly our sea surface temperature observations in some key periods. And so if you look on the top row of this figure, these are all of our existing estimates, our best products up until Duo's products. And it points out two features that have been puzzling to scientists for a while. One is the pretty extreme World War II warm anomaly. We knew there was a large El Nino event, but we didn't really have evidence of a 0.4 global anomaly worth of a El Nino event. And then we also saw pretty dramatically different trends in the North Pacific and North Atlantic, and shown in the upper right figure. But what Duo has done with a lot of work over the past 5+ years is gone in and done some pretty awesome data sleuthing, statistics, physical modeling to show that actually these data are pretty incompatible with our understanding of physics, and has made some corrections. And you can see those corrections on the bottom row that make this World War II warm anomaly much more reasonable for a large El Nino event, as well as corrects this North Pacific, North Atlantic discrepancy. And so, yeah, plugging both Duo's new product as well as the NCAR Climate Data Guide to check out for any of your data needs. But this is just an example of the awareness we need, especially as we start to think about making decisions with our science, of really all these two types of uncertainty. We have this aleatoric uncertainty, which connects pretty well with our understanding of statistics, that epsilon term at the end of all of our models. But lurking underneath is this epistemic uncertainty, really the understanding that we're not modeling things perfectly, we might be missing things, and really trying to capture that and communicate that to decision makers. And so with that, I'm going to transition over to the main results I'll be presenting today, which are more focused on climate projections. But just again, with this appreciation, I've been thinking a lot about of how much of what these climate projections really rely on this model development done over the historical period, and relying on this data that we know some things about and don't know others. But these same climate models are used to make climate projections, as you all know. And then these climate projections are what are used to understand how climate change will affect human and natural systems, or what I'll be calling climate impacts. And so now switching over, these slides I all got from Kevin Schwartzwald, so big thanks to him. He really has led this project through and through, and so it's, yeah, always an honor to be able to present this awesome work. But what we mean in this study now by climate impact projections is a specific definition used in the climate econometrics literature. And what studies we're referring to are studies that take some sort of historical weather data. And so in this case, we'll be just talking about daily temperature over the continental United States. And so we have some distribution of daily temperature. And what we're interested is finding a relationship between temperature and some sort of socioeconomic outcome. So I'll be using excess mortality due to heat in this example. And so this was a seminal study in 2011 that linked both excess warm heat to, or warm temperatures to excess mortality, as well as cold temperatures to excess mortality. And what then we're able to do once we fit these gray, what are known as dose response or damage functions, is we're able to understand, okay, if our temperature distribution changes on the top, the shift in warming from blue to red climate by end of 21st century, how much does our mortality due to heat change, the shift of these distributions over here? And so what this results in this case is a 3% increase in mortality over the continental United States due to heat-related death. And these are still how a lot of climate econometrics are done. A lot of them are now done in multivariate settings, but these are really important studies that are really underlying a lot of the climate impact assessments, in particularly the social cost of carbon. How much damage in dollars does a petagram of carbon do? And so if you're interested in learning more about how the philosophy of these studies works, I would really recommend this Carlton and Sang paper in 2016. It's a great review paper that really introduced me to the field. But uncertainty comes in a lot of places in these studies. we're taking historical weather data, we're fitting these dose response functions, then we're projecting this impact using changes to historical weather data. And so, of course, we have to choose observations. I just talked about how that can be a problem. And we have to think about how we want to summarize the impacts of climate and weather on humans, or what metrics we use. When we're thinking about projecting impacts, we have to choose some future climate data. And we also have to choose how we're processing that projection. If we're bias correcting, how we're bias correcting, and if we're downscaling. And then what I won't even come close to touching because it's out of my field, but it's fitting the dose response function bit. All of the choices that must go into this process. But luckily, there's a lot of great folks at Climate Impact Lab and other places really thinking about this carefully. But what I'll really focus on in this talk is how our choice of future climate data and really the uncertainty in our future climate data, how this affects uncertainty and future impacts. And so Hawkins and Sutton in 2009 wrote a pretty seminal paper talking about future climate uncertainty to the point where we now have three colors really defined with these three sources of uncertainty. And so just to quickly talk about sources in climate uncertainty, we have scenario uncertainty where we have different future outcomes due to different human activities. We have model uncertainty, which is different future climate due to different climate modeling decisions. So this is another example of that epistemic uncertainty I was talking about before. And then finally, we have internal variability uncertainty, which is uncertainty in future climate due to the chaotic nature of the climate system. And so just the classic figure from the Hawkins and Sutton paper is this one where they're showing in just decadal mean surface air temperature. The role of internal uncertainty starts out pretty substantial and decreases as we see the forced response kick in more and more. Scenario uncertainty follows approximately inverse, dominating by the end of the century, and model uncertainty remains substantial throughout. And so what we were interested in this study is really trying to understand how these three sources of uncertainty matter, not when we're looking at just temperature, but when we're looking at some function of temperature, in this case, mortality, corn yield, or GDP. And we were really interested to see how these different sources of uncertainty interplayed with the nonlinearities in these dose response functions, such as the one shown here. And so the climate econometrics community has lagged a bit behind the climate community in incorporating this science. So 5 years after Hawkins and Sutton, the first study that looked at even model uncertainty was published. Before that, almost every climate econometric study used a single run of a single climate model from the Hadley Center run in the 90s. And that was just because it was in the format that would work with their econometric program. So just again, open science plug quick right there, make your data accessible. But Burke et al. In 2014 showed that, okay, we should look at a few other climate models and see how that affects uncertainty and projections. And with the advent of coordinated single model initial condition large ensembles, like the first major initiative from Desert All 2020 and then the CMIP6 version, we're now able to really comprehensively look at these three sources of uncertainty in all sorts of applications. And so our plan was to perform a sensitivity analysis of some classical dose response functions and understand the contributions of all three sources of climate uncertainty to projections of three impacts, with a real focus on the open question at the time of how much internal variability mattered for projections of those impacts, and really when and where did internal variability matter. And so our plan, or what I'll be talking about now, is how we chose our dose response functions quickly. Spend most of my time talking about our methods and how we actually partitioned the climate uncertainty. And finally, some thoughts to open up the discussion on just some opportunities and challenges of fully incorporating these three sources of climate uncertainty into these impact projections. And so first off, we had to choose some dose response functions, and we ended up choosing three functions that were reliant just on daily temperature from the classical climate econometrics literature. So I already discussed our function on mortality. We also picked one on linking temperature to GDP per capita, as well as corn yields. And these were a useful three because they were all simple models. So they were just some function of temperature, and they were all estimated over the continental United States, where we have both good socioeconomic data and good climate data historically. And so what was nice about these as well is they generally span three common shapes of damage functions or dose response functions in the literature. We see a lot of functions have that U shape of mortality, such as migration and electricity consumption. Some are more linear, like GDP per capita. That's also cyclone damage and tropical conflict risk really follow this shape. And a lot of agricultural variables follow this, I forgot the proper name at the time, but really where there's no response, and then we hit some sort of biological maximum temperature where everything stops working. And so we were able to pick three functions that were at least somewhat generalizable to a broad class of problems. Next, we had to actually take these these dose response functions and use large ensembles to make climate impact projections into the 21st century. And so what we did is we used daily data from ERA5 and climate projections to apply just a delta shift of mean monthly climate to daily temperature data and understand the impacts in 3 30-year periods in the future. And so this is looking at the near-term effect of changes in temperature on heat-related mortality here, where each single dot on this plot is a single run from a large ensemble colored by the different models. And so what we were able to do is just take a few standard deviations to summarize the uncertainty. And so primarily what you see summarized on this dot plot or histogram is the internal and model uncertainties. We had to estimate scenario uncertainty with a separate analysis. But what we're doing mathematically is the internal uncertainty is the average standard deviation within each model. So really the spread within each model, we just average that. And what the model uncertainty here is we took the ensemble mean impact or the ensemble mean heat-related mortality and took the standard deviation of that. So how different the model's mean response were. And so what we saw here, which was pretty interesting, is that in projecting out the next 30 years, really decision relevant timescale, over half of the uncertainty in heat-related mortality came from internal variability over the United States. So really substantial contribution of uncertainty from internal variability. And so then we looked at the early, mid, and late 21st century, and we saw that as it gets hotter, as expected, we see increased heat-related mortality, and we're able to do the same decomposition. And so especially looking at the late 21st century, we see that there's a really dominant role of model uncertainty here, particularly because of that outlier GFDL-CM3 model. I don't have the slides in here to talk about it on this shorter talk, but basically this single model had a really strong seasonal response with pretty dramatic, like 8 degrees Celsius warming during the summer. And so we really saw this intense summer warming in this model that led to that really big outlier, but that led to a really high model uncertainty. And so we were able to then decompose uncertainty for each of our 3 damage functions or dose response functions, and we could see that the choice of dose response function and the shape of the dose response function affects how much the various sources of uncertainty matter. And so in particular, what was interesting is comparing these impact uncertainties back to just the climate uncertainty. And so on the left, I'm now showing this is the classical Hawkins and Sutton breakdown on just the temperature. But what we see, but even for the more linear GDP function, internal uncertainty matters more. And as we get to really nonlinear dose response functions like mortality, we see that internal uncertainty matters much, much more in the actual impact than it did in just the raw climate variable for temperature. And so again, just to say that internal variability is more important and often much more important for climate impacts than it is for the underlying climate variables. This study also allowed us to break down the uncertainty over the maps. Note that what I've been showing so far has been population weighted, so you might not immediately be able to map what you're seeing visually on these maps back to the figures I've been showing. But here, what's interesting is you can see that in red is where internal uncertainty matters substantially. And something that was surprising is that there were regions in the mid 21st century, so projections out 50-ish years, where internal uncertainty was still substantial. And in places where people live, like Chicago area and much of the kind of substantial areas of the country. And so we were able to conclude that the relative importance of climate uncertainty source really depends on many things. It, of course, depends on the time frame of interest, as has been shown in many studies by Hawkins Sutton, Flavio Lerner, many others. But we were able to see that the more nonlinear the dose response function, the more that internal uncertainty seems to matter, which makes sense intuitively, as we have a impact that happens really at the tails of our distribution. If we allow internal uncertainty in our projection, we're going to see those tails occur more often, or at least sometimes. We also saw that geography matters as well, both physical and human geography. So we might see very different results in those breakdowns if we had different population distributions. And so we were pretty able to substantially say that internal variability matters for near-term decision-relevant projections. So if we're talking about anything in the next 30 years, you better be considering internal uncertainty. It matters more with nonlinear relationships, as we often see in impacts, and it matters, of course, in areas with well-known existing strong internal variability. And I would direct you to all of Clara Desser's papers to look at where internal uncertainty matters throughout the world. And so to start to shift over to our discussion, I just want to think about a little bit of what we learned in this process of how to, Kevin and my thoughts on ways forward and fully incorporating climate uncertainty into impact projections. And so today I've talked about a few sources of uncertainty. I talked a little at the beginning about this choice of observations, how that could matter, and a lot about this choice of future climate data. But I just wanted to quickly highlight a really cool study that came out last year looking at a similar sort of study on how much the choice of bias correction method mattered for impacts. And so this paper by Lafferty and Shriver really showed that the downscaling uncertainty matters a ton for certain things. And so especially looking at temperature projections over data poor regions such as Lagos, Nigeria, we have substantial uncertainty due to this post-processing step, as shown in the darker tan color. And so just trying to think about how we could even build a framework to include all sources of uncertainty in climate impacts is, okay, we have 50 CMIP6 models. Each of them ran maybe somewhere between 1 and 100 members with 3, 4, 5 scenarios. And then we want to test out 10 different bias correction methods, 10 different downscaling methods. We want to compare with 10 different observational data products because we're looking at different variables. And then when we actually do the climate impact assessment model, they're doing many repetitions of their parameters through a Monte Carlo method. They might do hundreds of different trials of their parameter settings. And so you can see why this is blowing up. And you can, especially when you understand that these econometricians are running many, many simulations of their models, you can see, or at least cut them a little bit more slack on why they're only using a few climate model runs. And so we really can't do that full sampling of our uncertainty space, especially because many of these steps are so resource intensive, and we might not even have data to be able to validate. And so just trying to think about how we can incorporate the insights from this study. One thing is that when we were talking with econometricians, we learned that they don't really want to have to deal with CMIP. They really just want a data set, like a single ensemble that spans all of it. So an ensemble member that took maybe models of different ECSs, models with different amounts of climate variability, and just pick the best, I don't know, 10 or 50. And I know that's an unrealistic number, but really when they're dealing with this much other data, that's kind of the space they're looking in. And so there's some of these, but like the global crop model intercomparison did 20 scenarios, but only from 5 GCMs and not many simulations. And so we have this real tension as we start to think about how to make climate information available to more applied fields is they're really looking for a plug-in ready in their data format, ideally one ensemble member to be able to do their analyses. But we as climate scientists know that this is a really tricky task, and especially to do it in a generalized way. And so one way to proceed is to think about sensitivity analyses, which is somewhere Kevin and I are starting, especially Kevin in his postdoc, or when trying to really understand when do these sources of uncertainty matter. But really the way forward has to be interdisciplinary work. So really making sure that climate scientists are on these big projects that are incorporating climate information to make decisions and can guide when we have to care about internal variability and when we can average it out. And so I'd like to thank you again for having me to speak and excited to discuss this. More details can be found in our paper, and Kevin and I are both really happy to talk more about this. So thanks all.
Great. Thanks so much, Nathan. That was a fabulous overview, and it was great to hear kind of your mental model for how you think about uncertainty. I think what I was most struck by is when you talked about how the uncertainty sources really vary by human geography, like those maps, because uncertainty is difficult enough to communicate. And so I guess maybe my kickoff question will be, how can we, how do you think this could be communicated in a way that won't complete, if we're already talking about different sources and different geographies, what are the implications for kind of communicating uncertainty varying by geography?
Yeah, I think it's even just making it clear that there's not a one size fits all solution is a really important thing to talk about. I think that's something that we as climate scientists are generally so used to appreciating that everything, but just trying to continuously communicate that. It's like you have to understand if you're doing something really hyper local, you have to understand the climate and weather there. If you're doing something global or regional, you have to understand that you're going to make assumptions, but just be aware of what those assumptions are. I don't think I have a magic answer to that, but just trying to, as we're having conversations with climate impacts folks, have them appreciate their spatial scale of interest and spatial domain of interest. And again, I think there's some really good figures in a lot of the large ensemble papers that show this. So like, I don't have it in this talk, but like the classic Clara Desser figure of doing 40 different simulations of the future and just even showing that the trends can have different signs, just really hammer in that like, oh, there's so much uncertainty.
Great, thanks. I think Weston has a question and then Mary Beth. But Weston, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. This is super interesting. I know that I've heard about this paper before, but I've never actually seen you present anything on it. So this is really informative. And I had two questions. One was, so you showed all of this for temperature. Do you have a sense of how it would say change? And obviously I'm thinking about agriculture for precipitation, or if you included like a bivariate mapping of temperature and precipitation. And then my second question was a little more open-ended about, could this be applied to understand the time evolution in the historical context of impacts in these different spaces?
So the precipitation one is the easier one, saying that that's what, so Kevin just started a 2-year postdoc trying to look at the bivariate temperature precip question. Also incorporating process-based model evaluation. So just trying to understand if models are even fit for purpose to look at that relationship in the future. My sense is that, I mean, I think I won't speak too much out of what we've looked at so far, but basically like it's, as everyone knows, it's all more uncertain with precipitation. As far as trying to think about this framework over a historical period, that's really interesting. I originally had a slide at the end to kick off discussion of something that I'm really interested in thinking about is how to revisit our models now that we're starting to get more comprehensive uncertainty quantification methods of observational data. That combined with there's been a project led by, I think, Rob Wills and maybe Isla Simpson on trying to understand like what of our observed climate has been internal variability and what has been forced. And so I think like we're having a bunch of pieces come together to start to do some really cool science on understanding the forced versus internal components of what we've observed. So that's all I can say about that. I think it's a really cool area and a tricky one as well.
Mary Beth?
Hello, thank you for your talk. I heard that you were visiting CSU today, which is where I sit. So thank you for taking time to speak at this panel. So I had a question. You had shown the figure with the one GFDL model like as a huge outlier, and you're saying that you suspect that the reason there was so much model uncertainty was because of that outlier. So my like science question would be that if you were to take that out of the analysis, then does the ratio of the uncertainties look more like the beginning of the century? And then more like philosophical would be like, should we even be trusting these outliers? Like, is this within the realm of possibility? So it's good to include it. Or if it's this far out, should we be excluding it and then looking at like more of the similar models?
Yeah, so that'll at least thanks. That's a great question. It's fully answered in the supplement, which is always a bad half answer, but I can share at least some figures from looking at what we saw. And so really something interesting we saw is that in basically every other model, I'm showing the change of not only the warming from green to orange to red, but also the change in the seasonal cycle. And so these are population weighted temperatures over CONUS. And you see that most models warm, at least with this weighting, in a pretty flat way seasonally. And as I mentioned, GFDL has this really intense peak of warming kind of late summer, early fall. It really seemed to be driving this change in heat-related mortality. And yeah, we weren't able to dig too much into the physics for this paper, but we're really interested to understand, like, it's a great case study of like when should we not trust models? Like what is going on with the temperature precip, maybe coupling with the land surface causing such a crazy runaway kind of late summer, early fall, presumably some sort of feedback over the continental United States. And so I think your question was dead on of like, should we be discounting this model? And you'd really have to look into the physics there to have evidence for that. Or maybe this is a possible pathway our climate could go. Maybe there's some intense drying throughout the center of the country, because this really also was concentrated throughout the Great Plains into the Midwest. So yeah, it was like likely some sort of precip land crazy feedback situation. But yeah, I think it just also highlighted that if you're not looking at a lot of runs from a lot of different models, or you're blindly looking at a lot of runs for a lot of different models, you get some wacky results. And so when we did remove this model, we got results that made scenario uncertainty matter more and model uncertainty matter less, but internal variability stayed pretty constant. And those are all in the supplement, as well as comparing with the 3 best models from this group, according to a paper by Laura Suarez Gutierrez.
Great. I see Sanjeev, and Sanjeev is next. I don't know how much more time we have. Sanjeev and then Michelle. I don't know if we have more time than that.
Thank you, Nathan. This was a great talk. I hope decision maker hear all these talks. So I think my first question is, you touched upon this point. This become too much work on the decision maker or even planning level to incorporate these models. And so, what sort of encouragement or how we can convince them, or what are the things they might miss if they do not incorporate it? That's sort of first question. Okay, I'll let you answer, and then if Aaron allows me, I'll ask you more a difficult question later on.
I mean, I think something that a lot of folks have, I can't remember now all of the, I mean, there's just been a lot of papers in the extreme heat world, at least, on how we need many, many ensemble members to capture the worst impacts. And so I think I don't want to even start to list names because I'll miss some really cool science out, but there's just been so much work on in that space. And so I think extreme events is a good place to start for that need to communicate, because you're not going to get an extreme event in a ensemble need. So that would be my first place. And then as well as I actually had one of Clara's figures of showing just these are just different trends in the first large ensemble, and you see you get even different trend signs over 50-year periods in climate projection. So starting to just show figures like this as well as talk about extremes.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask one more question, Aaron?
Alyssa, I don't know where we are on time.
I think one more quick question is fine, and then we should cut it at 12:40 Mountain Time.
Okay, so that is a difficult one. How do you differentiate between model error versus internal variability? How you are going to communicate to the decision maker this portion of uncertainty is due to model error, or model not simulating internal variability correctly, or model has too much noise, versus this is something you really care about or that might impact your decision.
Yeah.
And related to that one, scenario uncertainty, it is fine. As a climate modeler, we can draw a line of net zero, 126, whatever we want. But that is not what we have followed over last 50 years. So there is evidence like which scenario we are going at least. So how does these kind of even that doesn't have a sort of a physical plausible evidence that we can go to 126, but we include it as a scenario uncertainty. I'll stop it there.
Yeah, so I'll answer at least in my opinion, the easier one first quickly with like, how do we, I might be changing your question slightly, but how do we encourage the use of internal variability in downstream impacts is, I think a nice analogy is that if you're working with a single member, or particularly with some sort of ensemble mean, you're basically looking at a world without weather. And so if anything you care about relies on weather, you're not going to be capturing that. That's a pretty, I know everyone in this room knows that's a simplistic view of internal variability, but it's at least a way to communicate to people like we need that additional variability if we're thinking about impacts. And then as far as scenario uncertainty, I think that's where these interdisciplinary collaborations are really needed, because I am not qualified to speak about which scenario we on or might be on or might more likely to be on. And so, I mean, I would really want to be working with someone like a Claudia Tibaldi, or someone who just like really understands what goes into making these decisions or these scenarios and how likely they are to occur. But it's a really good point you raised there.